The world before cold. You open your eyes to a pale wash of morning, the kind of thin light that slips in under a thatched eave, and makes the smoke above the hearth look like slow water. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth-cool and faintly damp. Every step remembers last night's ash, last week's rain, last year's frost. A rooster complains somewhere beyond the door. A bucket on a wooden peg sweats in the chill. Nothing hums, nothing glows. There is no machine waiting in a corner to hold back time for you. Here time doesn't hide. It leans on everything you intend to eat. It curls milk in a few hours. It turns soft bread, speckled and sour. It worries at meat with warm breath and small teeth you can't see. It waits at the edge of your day the way mist waits over the ditch, quiet, patient, certain. If you do nothing, your food becomes its food. This is not a metaphor. It is the rule by which everyone you know learned to live. You step outside. The village is waking by chores, not clocks. A smith's hammer rings in soft, stubborn rhythm. A child scatters hens with a stick. Someone's fire has the sweet bite of applewood, someone else's the dull comfort of peat. A woman crosses the green with a yoke across her shoulders, 2 pails knocking her shins. She moves at the ancient pace of work, the only speed that doesn't break the day in half. You pass the well and wash your hands until your fingers sting. When you dry them on your tunic, the skin smells of iron and cold rope. This is the scent of survival before cold storage, water, wood, smoke, and the soft panic that hums in your chest every autumn. Did we do enough? The seasons do not ask for permission to change. They only ask if you're ready. Inside the cottage, the air has 2 temperatures, warm by the fire, cool near the floor. Your eyes climb the walls and find the geography of endurance. A high beam dark, with years of soot, hooks that creak when you hang anything heavy. Clay jars along the low shelf, each with its small solution, wax lid oiled cloth, damp rag ash seal. In a corner, baskets roots, still dusted with the field. Above a tangle of herbs hung to dry time that smells like clean hands, sage with the breath of winter in it. The day's meal waits for its first decision. You run a knife through yesterday's loaf and listen to the sound, still springy, still good. The sound matters. You learn to hear safety. You tilt a small jug and taste the milk. Sweet but only just. It will be something else by dusk. You know this in your bones, the way you know how to find your bed in the dark, by habit, by touch, by a body that has already learned the shape of necessity. Time here is not the enemy only. It is also an ingredient. You will use it the way you use salt, carefully, deliberately, in measured pinches that make the difference between ruined and ready. The people you came from learned this by watching what outlasts weather and what does not. Drying outlasts damp, smoke outlasts flies, acid outlasts heat, darkness outlasts light, cellars outlast pride. Nothing in this world is an accident. Everything is a truce. Consider bread. It is both a comfort and a promise. It is also a clock. You can taste how long it has been alive. Freshness here doesn't mean luxury. It means urgency. Fresh fruit means eat now. Fresh milk means plan now. Fresh meat means begin. So you learn to reshape time into forms that refuse to spoil at its first touch. You rub salt like a spell. You ask smoke to kiss. You bury jars in the earth's cool breath. You let friendly sourness stand guard where sweetness invites trouble. You do not name the unseen helpers, though you work with them daily. You do not say yeast when the dough rises like a soft hill under cloth. You do not say bacteria when cabbage whispers to itself in brine. You say the jar is happy, You say the ale is awake. You say the milk is thinking. Language bends toward care when knowledge is carried mostly by hands. In a world that can't afford waste, patience does the heavy lifting. Patience is the flavor that makes everything edible twice. First, when you make it, then when you wait for it to become itself. It is uncomfortable sometimes, like the smoke in your eyes or the sting of salt in a cut. But it pays back in winter, when a small sound pop means a lid has held for months and the cabbage inside is crisp as a new idea. There are other sounds you learn to trust. The low rain of brine trickling through cracks in a tub, the small hiss when a seal yields, the dry rattle of beans in a clay jar, safety you can feel by ear. The room itself teaches you, if you listen, the rafters explain heat, the floor explains frost, the walls explain drafts, the cellar explains gravity. Books exist, but this is not a reading culture for your kind. You inherit your library by apprenticeship to the fire, to the crocs, to the seasons, to the old women who remember which corner of which shelf is the shade that doesn't sweat. You eat with other people, and that matters. Preservation is not only a private art, it is an economy and a promise. Today you might trade smoked eels for barley, tomorrow a wedge of cheese for a pot of honey next week. A handful of salt for the use of a neighbour's cool pit when your own grows damp. No one survives here alone, not through winter. The village keeps time together, like voices holding a note when one voice falters. There is a kind of theology in your kitchen, whether or not you go to church. You bless things with behaviour. You speak softly when jars are fermenting because calm seems to make them work better. You open lids leaning away because humility keeps your eyes safe when they spit. You name the first loaf of the harvest and give it away because gratitude preserves more than flour does. These are not superstitions to you. They are good manners toward the elements that feed you air, water, heat, darkness, and time. And yes, you fail. A jar swells ugly at the lid. A hunk of meat goes too near the flame and turns bitter. A bag of apples sweetens itself into collapse. The loss stings, but you learn to think in circles, not lines. Spoilage feeds the heap behind the cottage, and the heap becomes the soil, and the soil gives you beans that rattle like dry rain again. Time takes, time returns. Sometimes patience looks like leaving well enough alone. By midday, the cottage warms, and so do your plans. One shelf tells you what you can risk. Another tells you what must be guarded. The decisions you make are modest, but they add up to a map through the danger months. What to eat now, what to keep, what to trade, what to hide from mice and men. You don't think of yourself as clever. You think of yourself as careful. Cleverness is for stories. Carefulness is for supper. When night returns, it comes quickly and kindly. The fire loosens the day's hardness. A pot murmurs on the hook with a sound you could almost mistake for speech. You eat simply gratefully, and you feel the satisfaction that is not fullness exactly, but relief. The shelves still hold, the jars still breathe. The invisible allies worked while you worked. That is partnership enough. Before you sleep, you look once more at the beam where things hang, bundles, knots, a small shape in shadow that might be a joint of pork if you are lucky this month, or only herbs if you are not. Either way you nod to it. You are not being foolish. You are acknowledging the deal you made with time. I will give you labour and patience. You will give me tomorrow's breakfast. In ages to come, people will open quiet doors and fill their hands with cold without a second thought. They will forget the sound of safety and the smell of readiness. But here now, you know them by heart. You taste the future to make sure it is still good. You press your thumb to wax and hope. You listen for bubbles, for rattles, for the language of endurance. You are fluent. This is the world before cold, and it is not tragic. It is attentive. It is slow, where slowness is wise. It is honest about what can be saved and what cannot. To live here is to practice a craft that looks like cooking, but is really a way of keeping time from leaving all at once. If this slow walk into the past feels calming and useful, I'd love your support. Gently tap, like, subscribe for more quiet history and ring the bell so you won't miss the next chapter in our journey through medieval survival. Salt white gold of the poor. Morning comes with a clean edge. The fire is low and the room holds the last breath of night like a cup half full of smoke. On the table lies a slab of pork belly, pale and vulnerable, beaded with a faint sheen where the butcher's blade left it open to the air. You run a hand across the grain and feel a softness that won't last. Meat is a promise with an impatient clock inside it. If you do nothing, it will teach you a lesson about time you already know too well. You bring out the salt. It lives in a small jar, near the hearth kept dry, like a candle kept high above curious fingers. The lid is waxed and layered with cloth against damp and against theft. The crystals are irregular chips more than grains, grey in some places, almost glassy in others, and they clatter faintly when the jar tips a soft mineral rain. You do not measure with spoons. You measure with memory what a winter is likely to be, how fat the pig was, how often the wind from the marsh brings wet into the house. Your hand becomes a scale that knows the season better than a calendar. You scatter a first handful, and salt clings as if the meat had been waiting for it. You press with the heel of your palm, working the crystals under the surface until the flesh roughens and gives a little. Salt stings a tiny cut you didn't notice on your finger, and the sting is a kind of relief. Pain means the door is closing. You flip the belly and work again. Edges, seams, pockets where rot likes to hide. The table grows gritty. The air tilts toward the sea even though you are many miles from it. The craft has a rhythm you don't announce. Lay, rub pack, wait. You line a wooden tub with a scatter of crystals, a cool, glittering bed, then lay the meat as if setting a child down to sleep. You shake the jar and listen. That sound like a thin frost poured from a height is already a comfort. More salt over the top, thick at the corners, heavy at the centre, where it will weep. You tuck sprigs of thyme and a bruised bay leaf along the sides, not for magic exactly, but because the nose remembers generosity when hunger comes. Salt first always, herbs only after it has spoken. When the tub is full meat layered with salt, salt with meat you add a board and a weight, a stone smoothed by a river you walked as a child. The pressure matters. It squeezes out what time loves most to feed on wetness. Water will rise in an hour, and then in a day turning crystals to brine. You will drain a little tip, the tub taste a clean sharpness on your tongue, and pour it back. Reuse is a virtue here. Extravagance is a risk. Nothing about this feels exotic in your hands. But it is wealth by any sensible measure. Salt is labour-condensed men, cutting it from flats with wooden scrapers, women boiling brine until their arms ache, mules losing small patches of hair to the rub of sacks, sailors scouring their fingers with rope and spray. It has travelled farther than you have, and it will outlast you if kept dry. You could trade it for a pot, for a tool, for a favour that matters more than all the pots and tools you own. Kings have taxed it and fought over it because it plants itself in every kitchen without asking about birth or title. Your tub is a ledger. Each pinch an entry, each cured piece a proof of credit you can eat. You cover the tub with cloth and slide it into the corner where shade keeps its own counsel. The cottage goes on with its day, fetching, grinding, mending, and the salt goes on with its quiet work. By noon, the belly has changed colour, and the surface shows a gloss that wasn't there before. Tiny lakes form at the edges, brine cupped in a fold. You tilt the tub, and the liquid runs cold against your knuckles. When you taste it, the mouth tightens and wakes, and for a moment you feel a shore at your back that you've never walked. Not all salts are the same. Traders tell stories in their prices. A hard, bright salt that comes pure from far quarries and behaves like a stern teacher. A grey salt, flecked with clay, that feels patient and forgiving. A salt that tastes faintly of smoke because the wind at its place of birth carries more hearths than sea. You learn their moods by error and hunger. One batch dries meat too fast and leaves the centre soft. Another cures sweetly, but needs vigilant turning. The tongue is your teacher and the stomach your critic. Monastic notes you once saw at market speak of days and weights and the shape of barrels, but here in a cottage where ink is used to mark births and debts, not recipes, you keep the record inside your knuckles. The village lives on this work the way a body lives on a pulse. Not just meat though, pork is king, where pigs are cheaper to keep than cattle, but fish from rivers that sulk in their banks when spring floods recede. Eels sharp and slippery, endure salt well and take smoke after. Their fat holds flavour through lean months. Trout keeps its manners if you handle it kindly, and salt soon. Even a glut can be made obedient. When a net is too full, you do not weep at waste. You fetch the jar and give the day a longer life. The tub gathers its small transformations. Days later, the pork is more itself by becoming less of what it was firmer, a little darker edges, squared by pressure. You take a narrow knife and lift a corner. The smell tells you the most important thing first. There is no hurry to cook it. Hurry is for fresh things. Salt makes time an ally. You rinse the piece in beer if you have it, or in vinegar if a batch has gone to that bright sourness. You value now more than when it was wine. You dry it with a cloth, and the cloth remembers the taste later when you wash it. Everything carries the signature of what saves you. There is discipline to salt you wouldn't have discovered without necessity. It sets boundaries for appetite. You can't eat salted meat every day and remain cheerful. The body craves softness and green after too much brine and smoke, so the salted thing becomes accent and anchor rather than feast a piece shaved thin to wake a pot of beans. A sliver rendered to gloss onions in a pan, a heel of bacon lifted into a pot at dawn to promise satisfaction at dusk. Salt teaches stewardship. It stretches a kill across weeks and a season across months. It makes enough out of a little and keeps a plenty from becoming a sin. The politics of salt arrive at your door even if you never leave the village green. A steward might count sacks more closely one year than the last. A levy might rise because some lord's war is more expensive than his father's. A merchant may cut his brine with river water to increase his barrels and sell you a dilution that shortens what you meant to lengthen. You become a taster of honesty and a buyer of seasons. When you find an honest barrelman, you remember his mark burned into the stave and pay him with respect, quick as coin. Reputation in salt is as durable as the product itself. You share too. A pinch can build a road between two houses. A fistful can settle a quarrel. A small bag can begin a courtship if offered at a door in late winter, when the wind bites hard and everything grown tastes of memory. Salt is a grammar of generosity, enough to show care, not so much that care feels like pity. Children learn the language early. They grow up licking fingers and slapping hands and watching their elders nod over tubs and crocks with that look, which means, without words, we will get through. Failure belongs to the craft. A piece salted on a warm day when flies were quicker than you. A tub kept too near a wall that wept during a storm. A weight too light to push back the stubbornness in a thick shoulder of meat. You pay attention not to shame yourself, but because attention is the only way to keep loss small. When failure comes, you do not turn it into drama. You cut, you bury, you clean with vinegar and ash, and the lesson holds better than if someone had read it to you from a page. When the meat is ready for the next stage, you move it to where smoke can reach it gently. Salt and smoke agree about many things, but not everything. They are old co-workers who do their best work when neither is asked to do all the work alone. What salt-dried smoke will perfume and protect. What smoke cannot reach evenly salt has already made less attractive to hunger. The two together make an argument the mouth will accept and winter will obey. What you remember most, though, is not theory but feeling. The grainy drag of crystals under your palm, the soft surrender as water leaves and flesh firms, the hush in a room when you've laid a winter's worth of meat to rest and the air smells bright and clean as if stone had a fragrance. You remember the days when the jar felt empty too early and you scraped at corners for enough. You remember the year a neighbour's husband broke his wrist and you shared half your store because sometimes the only difference between tragedy and inconvenience is whether someone knocks before you do. Imagine the map that salt draws across your world. From beds beside distant sea marshes, to the belly of your room, from underground vaults to the surfaces of tongues and cuts and table boards. Across that map travel coins, rumours, marriages, altercations, and hymns. Salt takes a pig and turns it into days you haven't met yet. It turns a fish into a way to sit by the fire in late January without fear. It turns labour into a story that sits in your mouth and says, "Calm yourself, we prepared." By night the tub looks like nothing. Cloth, board, a stone that could be any stone, but you sleep better because of it. You lie down within walls that you and everyone before you have darkened with smoke and touched with wet hands and sharpened with knives, and your body understands that safety is often invisible until the day it is needed. Salt gives you that kind of safety. Modest, stern, unsentimental. It does not soften. It does not flatter. It does not heal. It holds. Tomorrow, you'll lift the board, turn the meat pack more, where crystals have melted into their work, and check the corner where brine collects. You will do it without announcement as you stir the pot without ceremony, or count beans without counting aloud. This is not spectacle, it's continuity. And continuity is the hidden luxury of the poor, the ability to say next week and mean it. Salt makes that sentence true. It is the white wealth you keep in a jar that no tax collector can entirely steal because he cannot find every corner you've learned to keep dry. It is the lesson that permanence is sometimes nothing more than dryness placed carefully between appetite and time. It is the taste of a future that doesn't scare you. You blow out the rushlight and listen to the room settle. Somewhere a drop falls, where it always falls after midnight, off the lip of a crooked beam. The tub is a darker square in the dark. You can almost feel the crystals continuing their patient work, a million tiny hands drawing water toward themselves. Away from what you will need when snow lies close around the house, and the path to the well is a narrow trench, hip deep with the winter's proof. You close your eyes and let that thought be the last thing you handle today. Salt is working, which means you can rest. Smoke the fire that never sleeps. Dawn pulls a grey thread through the rafters, and the first thing you smell is yesterday, a sweetness folded into soot, a faint bitterness where fat once dripped the woolly warmth of ash. It has lived in the wood for years now, this perfume of survival. You could walk into this cottage blind and still find your way to the beam where meat hangs the hook, where a chain clinks softly, the notch where a shutter latches against a stubborn wind. Smoke doesn't just rise here, it inhabits. You tend the fire before you speak to anyone. A smouldering bed looks asleep, but it dreams in heat. You rake the coals, so they spread like a thin red horizon, and feed them a careful handful of split oak. Not too much. Smoke must kiss, not bite. You learn that from a neighbour who once laughed you out of a bitter ham. Fire is like a horse, pull the reins and it rears, loosen and it wanders. You ask it to walk. The room lifts into its usual weather. Blue ribbons close to the floorboards, brown gauze under the beam, a clearer patch by the door that never quite stops leaking the outdoors in. Overhead hangs a geography of food-made patient links of sausage braided into gentleness. A slab of pork turned darker than last week's thoughts. Strings where fish once glittered and will again. The beam is not straight anymore. Generations of weight have taught it to bow slightly, a wooden acknowledgement of hunger's long tenure. You choose wood the way a singer chooses pitch. Oak for authority, beech for an even listening heat. Apple, if you can afford a whisper of sweetness. Alder, when fish are on the hooks and you want a light hand. You learned early that resinous wood's pine fir spit their tempers and leave a taste like old candles. The nose keeps a ledger that never forgets. Every stick you lift carries a future in it. The work is part housekeeping, part chemist's patience, part prayer. The surface of yesterday's pork shows a film that isn't quite grease and isn't quite varnish. If you touch it, your fingers come away tacky and a ghost of flavour holds on. You know without names what the smoke is doing, souring the welcome for creatures too small to see pushing water toward the air, and leaving hardness where softness once invited ruin. Someone in a monastery miles away writes careful Latin about wood and thyme and incense, and calls it order. You who cannot spare ink on anything but births and debts, call it common sense and keep feeding the coals. Children complain about stinging eyes, and then ask for the sausage ends when you tie lengths to hang. Their coughs keep time with the little pops, where sap finds a voice in the log. They will remember that sharp comfort for the rest of their lives, how winter put its hands up against the glass and smoke became another pain. Even lungs that grow old in rooms like this understand gratitude when snow comes down sideways and the road to the well is a trench. You lift a strip of belly and test it with the flats of your fingers. The give tells you the day's plan. It needs hours, not days. It wants warmth, not heat. You hang it back and set the draft the way your mother taught you. One shutter pinched the other, a thumb's width open. The door cracked with a wooden wedge, so the room breathes in long, steady sighs. Fire eats air. You make sure it never grows greedy. Greed tastes like soot. Patience tastes like brown sugar. The village has never seen. In a better year, the village smokehouse will be shared an outbuilding with a low door and a roof that holds weather the way a big hand cups a flame. Everyone brings their hungers and hopes to the same place, and stories collect under that roof the way soot does. Advice travels in curls, bank your fire with damp and dash, turn fish by the noise of its drip, give sausage a day of rest before a day of smoke, or the skins will sulk and split. There is authority in communal air. Even stubborn men go quiet and listen to a woman who has never spoiled a ham. Salt may have begun the work, but smoke teaches completion. Salt draws water outward. Smoke insists that outward is the right direction. Where salt closed doors, smoke stands guard. Where salt preserved flesh smoke, preserves memory the particular unmistakable flavour that says winter's table is honest and the cook respects time. It is the punctuation mark on a sentence that began at slaughter. You don't need to speak it aloud to know the grammar. You have failed here too, and the failures teach with a cudgel. A fire run too hot paints meat with bitterness, and calls it done long before the centre has agreed. A stray gust steals your careful draught, and leaves streaks pale on one side, tarred on the other. Once a hook gave way, and a ham met the floor with a soft mortal thud. You said a word you would not say before a priest, and cut the bruised part away with a knife that felt heavier than it should. You fed the dog, and the dog looked at you with the grateful eyes of a thing that doesn't know about lean months. Fish make their own rules. Eels accept everything. Salt, air, smoke, and come through sweetly if you bind their fat with patience. Trout demands light and brief kisses, or it grows sullen. Herring is a crowd job, a festival of hooks, a rafter turned into a silver language. You learn to hear when fish is ready, the drip slows, the skin tightens like drumhead. The room changes from river to hearth. The change is audible if you sit very still and give your ears to the day. You do sit still sometimes for the sake of the work, and for the sake of your bones. Fire sounds like rain when it's correct. No clapping, just a low, steady happening. The smoke pulls toward the roof and blurs the world just enough that the present looks manageable. The beam above you wears its history in layers each season, a dark glaze added to the last. If a stranger scraped it, they would find a timeline of the village fat years slick, with gloss-hungry years thin and brittle. The house keeps the book you cannot afford to bind. The nose becomes the supervisor. Bitter is warning, sweet is flirtation, sour is scolding. You adjust by handfuls, by pinches, by the same faith you use to salt the belief that attention is the only power granted to the powerless. You sweep embers into a crescent so the pan for dripping fat can sit in a clear patch. You put a small bowl of water on the hearthstone to give the air a softness cured meat appreciates. Your hand becomes a weather-vane palm, up to the flow of warmth palm down, to judge how far it has travelled before it cools. Precision without numbers lives in bodies that have repeated the same mercy for years. You step outside to split kindling, and the cottage exhales behind you like an animal that trusts its keeper. From the path, you can see a dozen other smokes drawing lines into the sky, blue, brown, grey, each with its own dialect. This is the village's other bell tower. It tells you what the season is doing, and who is hopeful, and who is anxious, and who has killed the pig earlier than usual, because debts will not wait for fattening. You read it the way a seaman reads wind. By afternoon, the meat has learned enough. You turn every piece with a cloth between hand and flesh, not for heat, but for respect. Salt roughens skin, smoke stains it, but both answer to gentleness. You check ties, nudge hooks, decide what stays, and what can descend to a cooler corner to rest. Rest is part of the recipe. Smoke that lingers becomes flavour. Smoke that accumulates becomes punishment. You taste when no one is looking. A thin shaving from the edge of a slab, loosened with your thumb, warmed a moment over a coal until the fat glows. The first bite is a mapwood patience, yesterday's weather, the steadiness of your hands. If you did well, the meat tastes inevitable, as if it could not have been otherwise. If you fumbled, the mouth tells you where too much hurry on the fire, not enough turning a draught that sulked. Evening tips the window from pewter to ember. You bank the coals until they look like a field of small sunsets. The room is gentler now, a place you can breathe without negotiation. A child sleeps with his head on a folded cloak, marked by a dark crescent where his hair met the air. Your clothes will carry this smell to market tomorrow, and people will know what work you've done before you speak. There is pride in that, the clean kind, not the kind that makes enemies. Before bed, you sweep the hearth with a whisk made of twigs. Push the last crumbs of char into a safe corner. Set a pan under the slowest drip. You open the door for 3 long breaths and let the room trade air with the night. Stars lean in the opening like seeds caught in black cloth. You close latch, listen. The meat creaks once as it cools, an animal sound, almost then quiet. In the dark, smoke keeps working. What you began in daylight goes on without you, a partnership perfected by repetition and error, and the humility of those who cannot afford waste. Salt made a promise. Smoke fulfills it in the grammar of warmth, phrase by phrase, layer by layer, a soft argument against hunger that winter at last will accept. Tomorrow there will be vinegar on the table, sharp as a bell, ready to answer where smoke cannot. But tonight the house wears its own weather, and you sleep under it the way sailors sleep under canvas safe, because something above you is catching what would otherwise swallow you whole. Vinegar and brine, the alchemy of women. The morning has a sour edge you've come to trust. It rises from the corner where the barrels sit, a bright prickle in the nose. Not cruel, not kind, simply alert. You lift the lid from the nearest cask, and the air sharpens again as if it has put on a clean shirt. Inside, a pale cloud floats on a surface, the colour of amber tea. Slices of cabbage and onion ride the currents when you stir, bumping gently like boats in a quiet harbour. The liquid licks the rim and leaves it shining. Your mouth waters before your mind gives permission. That is how you know you've done it right. This is a workshop that looks like a kitchen. The table is pocked and salted with years of small storms. A mortar waits with the dignity of a trusted elder. Bundles of dill mustard seed and bay leaf lean in a stone jar like guests who arrived early and brought the conversation with them. There's a line where women have stood, shoulders set, sleeves, tied hands, red from cold water to the line. So clear your feet, find it without thinking. You stand where they stood, because brine and vinegar are a craft handed down palm to palm, far more reliably than anything written. You begin with water that has been asked to be patient, drawn from the well left, to settle the way people must before they're fit for company. You warm it barely, only enough to help salt let go of itself. The handfuls you scatter are neither stingy nor proud. They fall in a small rain, and when you stir, the spoon tells you the truth. Grit at first, then smooth, then the faint drag. That means the water has become a tool. You taste, and the taste makes you blink. Good. Brine should wake you, not scold you. The vinegar is a story with accidents in it. Ale that stayed too long in a warm corner and found a second life. Wine that began to forget itself and was persuaded to remember in a different language. You've kept a jar of mother, the strange skin that forms when vinegar breathes like a lucky coin wrapped in cloth. It glides as you pour a ghost at home in the bottle, and it brings with it a calm you have earned. You mix brine and vinegar in proportions your hand knows, because recipes here are not numbers first, they are thresholds. Enough to make rot hesitate. Enough to make crispness think twice about leaving. You pack the vegetables with a rhythm the body loves. Cabbage, then salt, then a fist of dill. Onion, then mustard seed, and a peppercorn or 3. A split clove of garlic for the jar that will be opened on cold days when the house needs a bright remark. Carrots shaved so they bend instead of break. Cucumbers, if the summer has been kind. A sprig of thyme for piety, a bay leaf for patience. You press each layer with the flat of your fist until the squeak tells you the air has risen out and the jar is ready to be filled. The sound is proof that the pieces have agreed to live close without quarrelling. When the brine meets the vegetables, there is a change you can hear if you keep quiet. A small click under the surface, a hush of bubbles collecting at edges and rising like secret laughter. You pour slowly, stopping just below the lip. You slide a clean chip of wood or a smooth stone on top to hold everything down. Down is safety, up is risk, and you seal the mouth with cloth dipped in warm wax that smells faintly of honey. The wax cools under your thumb and becomes certainty. You write nothing on the jar. You do not need to. Your hands know the afternoon. Your tongue will know the day. Some women say a jar must sleep through 3 moons before it earns its place at table. Others swear by 9 days and a quiet prayer to street, Martha. A few listen to the weather. When the first frost writes its name on the river, they open the first lid. You are loyal to outcomes, not omens, but you honour the old timings because timing is most of the work. Too soon, and sharpness bullies everything else. Too late, and the world inside the jar falls asleep past waking. The middle has to be found again and again, like a path through fog. There is commerce in these liquids as surely as in salt or smoke. Alewives brew, and where ale lives, vinegar is a neighbour who shows up often enough to be expected. Some women sell their sours by the cup at market, the coins bright with fingerprints. Others barter a jar for flax or a pair of needles or a morning's help when a baby is due. A good vinegar keeps a household in favours as much as food. It also keeps a house in order. The same sharp spirit that makes an onion safe in January will make a table shine when mixed with ash and rubbed with a rough cloth. Cleanliness and preservation walk the same road and nod to each other often. You think sometimes about what the sour is actually doing, how it makes a place where the small teeth of spoilage lose their nerve. You do not say acid or pH, but you know a tilted world when you taste it. Vinegar feels like a decision the jar made to take your side. Brine is its bodyguard. Together they draw water from danger and hold the line against the soft slide into ruin. You can see that truth in the brightness of a carrot slice, months later in the snap, when your teeth meet a cucumber that has not seen the sun since midsummer. Not everything is triumph. A lid sometimes domes like a sick child's belly. You press it and feel the question under your hand. You open to find a white bloom where there should be none. You scrape, you scold, you save what you can. You feed the rest to the heap that will feed the soil, that will feed your jars again. Loss is part of the circle. The cleverness lies not in avoiding it completely, but in making it smaller than your patience. Ritual collects around the craft, the way steam finds a beam and clings there. You whisper when you seal, because loud voices seem to knock something loose. You keep the jars where they can hear the fire, but not feel it directly. You tap the cloth with a fingernail and listen for that quick, hollow note, which means the wax has set and will keep its promise. You thank the mother when you pour her back into her jar. None of this asks belief from anyone else. It asks only attention from you. There is kindness in keeping summer alive for winter mouths. The colours in the cellar glow like small flags, greens and oranges and golds, stacked in the cool, each a memory with a lid. On a day when the sleet hits the door in mean little slaps and the bread takes too long to rise, you bring up a jar and the room changes key. The first forkful puts heat in places fire cannot reach. Children who have forgotten what gardens look like remember by flavour. Men who have been cutting wood since dawn lean back and close their eyes for a breath after the first bite, as if a crisp sound has rung inside the head where dullness sat all morning. You don't only pickle vegetables. Eggs after a feast, so the celebration keeps talking for a week. Fish when the catch was better than the stomach's patience. They come out later, as small astonishments. Even fruit some years, plums that survive, on a sour sweetness that makes January feel like it's remembering July. The boundary of the craft is not the pantry, it is your courage. The worst that happens is a lesson. The best is a habit that feeds you for as long as your hands can lift a jar. In other houses, in other towns, they brag of glass so clear you can read through it, and the rich seal their fruits with sugar that comes dearer than meat. You have your pots and your wax and your faith in a sharper path. Sugar is a guest in your kitchen. Vinegar is family. You think of monks writing in careful hands about remedies and diets and penances, and you smile to imagine how many of those notes were copied from women who could not write at all, but knew exactly how long a cabbage should sit under a prime certain window. By late afternoon, the sour in the room has relaxed into background music. You sit and rub your hands with oil scented by a mercy of last year's herbs. The jars stand in their ranks, cooling, settling, making small sounds like polite conversation in a warm hall. Tomorrow, you'll move them to the shelf below the beam, dark, dry, safe. In a week, you'll open one, because patience is best when tested. In a month, you'll carry a pair to a neighbour who just buried his father, because food that wakes the mouth can wake grief into something easier to carry. Before you sleep, you pass the corner again and tilt a jar to catch what little light remains. The slices inside look crisp enough to answer if you ask them a question. You don't. You've asked enough of them today. You press the lid gently and the wax holds. That's all you need to know. You turn back to the hearth where something mild is thinking about boiling. The house smells of smoke and sharpness and the hands that made them agree. Time once again has been invited to behave. Fermentation, the living miracle. The day begins with a sound so small you'd miss it if you hurried a little sigh under cloth, the softest fizz where bubbles find their way to light. On the table sits a bowl, swaddled in linen, a clay jar, with a wooden lid and a crock that looks like a sleeping animal. Nothing here is dramatic. Everything here is alive. You lift the cloth. The dough beneath has risen like a hill under snow, gentle, rounded, sprinkled with a dust of flour that looks like frost caught in a sunbeam. You press a fingertip into its surface. The dent fills slowly and stops, as if the dough has decided that a small scar belongs to it. You don't say yeast. You say the leaven is awake. You don't say metabolism or carbon dioxide. You say the dough is breathing. Your words are older than the words a scholar might supply, but your knowing is exact. Bread begins with yesterday. A scrap of sour from the last loaf, saved in a little jar fed with water and flour, left by the warmest patch of wall where the fire kisses stone. It smells like apples kept too long and then forgiven. You stir it with a wooden spoon that remembers the shape of the bowl, and the spoon comes away, webbed with threads that refuse to fall. That stickiness is history holding hands with hunger. You pour a little of the starter into the bowl, add water, salt, more flour. The spoon labours, then yields. You knead until the dough wants to spring back, until your shoulders remember something. Your grandmother taught your hands without words: push, fold, turn, rest. When it finally lies smooth, you bless it the only way that matters here, by giving it time it can use. While the bread proves you visit the crocks, one holds cabbage talking quietly to itself in brine. The voices are small and regular, like neighbours gossiping over a hedge, nothing urgent, nothing unkind, just proof that the village is awake. You open the lid, and the scent rises, sharp, clean, faintly sweet at the edges. You pack down the floating leaves, with a fist-sized stone coaxing stray bits back under the safety of the liquid. Air is trouble, liquid is truce. You learned that the first year you tried this and lost a jar to a fir, you could wipe away, but could not forgive. Another crock holds barley that has been sprouted and dried, and now soaks cokes toward a drink that warms a cold house better than a blanket ale, the daily bread in a cup. You stir, and the grains rise and fall like a school of little fish. Later, you'll boil, then cool, then ladle the sweet wort into a clean, smoke-scented tub. You'll pitch balm foam saved from the last brewing, lifted carefully like cream. It looks unruly, a froth that won't be reasoned with, and that is exactly why you keep it close. Left alone, the liquid would sour into something thin and scalding. With balm it wakes as ale kind, nourishing quick to forgive the day's mistakes. This saving of a little from the last to feed the next is the grammar of your life. A scrap of sour, a ladle of balm, a spoon of whey, the heel of yesterday's cheese starters and mothers and cultures and charms. You keep them the way you keep stories, adding to them each time, tasting for balance, never letting the jar go quite empty. There is a fear inside this habit. Of course, the fear that one misstep will end a lineage you cannot replace, but there is also pride. Your leaven is older than your eldest child. Your balm has survived 2 winters and a summer that smelled of smoke for weeks. Your cucumbers owe their backbone to a spice you traded for a favour 3 villages away. Continuity tastes different from invention. You can tell with your eyes closed. Midday finds you at the abbey gate with a small jug and a bigger curiosity. The monks brew in shadowed rooms that smell of grain and hymn. Their kettles are polished like armoured beetles. Their logs are neat and orderly, the way prayer books are neat and orderly. A lay brother shows you the cool trough where hot wort rests, while winter air thinks about it. He speaks of hours, and heat the way you speak of wind and wood, his words as careful as his hands. He lets you taste a sip that has not yet learned to be ale. It is sweet and shy. Later, when the balm does its slow thunder, it will grow a backbone. You will trade onions for a cup when the time comes. You will drink it and remember that even holy men must trust bubbles. Back home the dough has crested. You shape it, score it one long. Cut a promise to the steam that will rise and set it near the fire where it can think about its future. You light a small blaze in the bake oven, then draw the coals when the interior goes the colour of iron. Your hand learns the heat without a dial to tell it. You test the mouth of the oven with your wrist the way your mother tested milk. The loaf goes in and you close the door with a board made smooth by use. The smell begins first flour, then something rounder, warmer, like kindness. You keep yourself from opening too soon. Patience is not a virtue here, it is a tool. There are failures, and they are teachers with sharp tongues. A dough too cool, and it sulks, a dough too warm, and it yawns and collapses. A jar of cabbage left under too thin a brine grows a cap you do not trust. You lift it, taste, spit, and do not argue with your mouth's wisdom. A brew pitched too hot kills the balm, and you drink sadness for a week thin and scolding as a bad sermon. You don't curse, you begin again. Fermentation punishes haste and flatters attention. The bargain is plain. Afternoon leans toward evening, and you turn to milk. Yesterday, you set a bowl near the hearth, where the air is warm but not bold. This morning, the surface trembled when you nudged it a quiver instead of a splash. Now it is thicker clabbered curds, shyly separating from whey. You break it with a spoon, and the lines look like page edges under water. You salt lightly, maybe stir in a snip of chive, and spread it on the heel of a crust, the first slice from the loaf that cracked open as if it remembered your knife from last week. The taste is gentle, almost a whisper. You do not call it cheese. That word belongs to something firmer and more sure of itself, which will come later in the year when rennet and waiting teach milk how to stand. For now, this spoonable softness is enough. It is the dairy's way of saying yes, without boasting. In the corner, a small jar of beet kvass practices its quiet, earthy music. You didn't plan to make it. You made it because the beets were bruised and would not keep as they were. Now the liquid glows like a sunset bottled by a patient hand. You drink a mouthful when your work flags. It tastes like a walk in a root cellar with a candle-dark sweet faintly electric. It is not a feast. It is a reminder that transformation can be modest and still be worthy. Evening gathers, and you set a bowl of ale near the fire for the old man down the lane, whose hands shake less when he holds something warm. You fill a cup for yourself and think about the day how many times you asked the invisible to behave, and the invisible answered. You fed what could not be seen, and in return it fed you. That is not magic. It is manners. You wipe the table, and the cloth picks up smells you will carry to bed, the fruity sour of leaven, the clean bite of brine, the whisper of malt, the milky hush of clabber. Your skin remembers them, and so will your children. They will know when a jar is happy by the look of its lid. They will know when the dough needs folding by the way it slumps. They will know when a brew is right by the tune the bubbles hum against the side of the tub. This is literacy in a language that never sees ink. Before you sleep, you portion out tomorrow's start, a spoon of sour tucked away, a saucer of balm, saved under cloth, a ladle of whey, kept for the morning's porridge to make it bright. You are not hoarding, you are seeding. There is a difference. Hoarding is fear folded into a dark corner. Seeding is faith, placed where light can find it. A last look at the crocks, and the bowl, and the jar, and you let darkness wrap the room. Somewhere beneath a lid, a bubble rises and pops. Somewhere in the oven's cooling heart, a crackle answers the night. Somewhere in the jug of ale, a faint foam lips the rim and settles again. The house is a choir of small living yeses. If anyone asks what you did today, you could say you kept watch. Over dough, over jars, over a tub of warmth where grain is turning into comfort. But what you really did is simpler and grander. You borrowed a little life from life to keep life going. You took the wildness that floats in air and rides on skins and hides in husks, and you gave it a home. In return it gave you bread that breathes drink, that steadies vegetables that shine in winter when the sun forgets to stay. You did not conquer time. You learnt to invite it in and ask it to sit down and be useful. The earth's belly cellars and underground safety. At the back of the cottage, past the hedge, where nettles keep nosy goats honest, a low door waits half buried in the ground. It is a plain thing, planks banded with iron, a leather loop where a handle might be if you were richer. You lift it and a breath rises that doesn't belong to weather earth cool, stone damp, sweet with the sleep of roots. The cellar does not care what month your calendar thinks it is. It keeps its own season steady and slow, the way an old heart keeps time after a hard climb. You set the lantern on the first step and watch the light behave as if weighed down. Smoke drifts downward, not up. The air is thick but not stale, cool but not cruel. Your hand learns the rail by feel oak worn, to satin by the descent of people you miss and people you resemble. Every house has a face. This is the house's quiet mouth, opening to say, bring what you hope to keep. The floor crunches faintly under straw. You stoop. The ceiling is low-ribbed, with beams that shine. Where hands have polished them, velvet black, where soot and time agreed to share. Along the walls sit barrels and crocks with chalk marks. You can read by memory C for carrots, N for neeps, P for parsnips, B for beets. Nets of onions hang like dusky moons. Cabbage's squat under leaves you left on purpose, their outer rags shielding the heart as bark shields a tree. Apples rest in wooden trays, not touching each one a small fragrant planet with its own gravity of perfume and rot. Temperature is a tool here, not a number. You know the far corner is the coldest, by the way. Your breath shows there first. You put the last cabbages there when the year turns mean. Near the steps is kinder. That is where potatoes abide, tucked in bins with a sprinkle of earth to keep their skins from toughening into bitterness. The back wall sweats after rain, best for barrels of brine and fermented things that like a damp breath on their lids. Even without a scholar's words, conductivity, convection. You practice their sense. Cool and stable slows the hurry of decay. Dark and close keeps sprouts from dreaming too early. You build microclimates with peasant cunning. A crate with a false floor and a sprinkling of sand becomes a beach where carrots nap without shriveling. A lidded box with a handful of charcoal at the bottom drinks stray damp before it can turn an onion soft at the neck. A pot inverted over a small plate of quicklime keeps one shelf dry when the river rises and the soil remembers how to seep. The cellar is an instrument. You tune it with straw sandboards and habit. Ventilation is the cellar's shy cousin. Too much and the cold breaks its promise. Too little and the air grows heavy with the exhale of things trying not to die. You lift the small shutter near the ground on dry days, close it when fog thinks itself invited, crack it only a finger's width in snow. Your ear learns to hear staleness, how a lantern burns hoarsely, how a potato smells too loud. You do not own a chimney down here. You own the patience to let breath find its way without being scolded. Vermin have ambitions. You answer them with architecture. The steps have a lip they can't read. Bins sit on bricks in shallow pans of water a moat mice dislike. Every sack has a ring of nettles tucked around its base. Custom more than science, but custom often arrives before science with a broom and gets the job done just as well. You set a cat's sleeping basket near the door and feed her in the kitchen. She patrols out of boredom as much as hunger, which is exactly the level of zeal you want. Not all storage is indoors. Come late autumn, you build clamps in the field, long mounds of roots banked with straw and earth sheds, without walls that the sky pretends not to notice. You lay a drain of twigs along the ground pile beats and swedes like cordwood, then wrap the heap in layers straw first for breath, soil last for darkness. A turf cap finishes the business, a greenish hat that shrugs off rain. Mark the ends with sticks and prayer. After snow, the clamp looks like nothing at all, which is useful when hungry eyes wander. Failure teaches with perfect clarity. A week of thaw in January, followed by a snap can sweat rot under the best of plans. You slice a cabbage and find a brown secret at its core. You cut again until green returns. Then eat that night what you saved, knowing tomorrow may ask you to be less lucky. The apples softened near the wall because the river told the ground a story it could not keep to itself. You stew them with cinnamon if you have it, or with patience if you do not. A barrel staves leak. You hammer home a wedge of riven oak and rub the seam with tallow, then turn the barrel so gravity becomes ally again. Some cellars are grand. The manors runs as broad as a lane, ecclesiastically arched in stone, with bins measured in dozens and racks of bottles that can whisper Latin when the steward passes. Yours is not grand. It is sufficient. Sufficiency is the poor person's luxury, and the cellar is its treasury. Down here, choices. Wait Shall we cook the tired onions first, or the spotted apples, the carrots that have learned to sigh, or the turnips that are still sure of themselves? Waste is sin, where work is worship. You tithe against it with attention. You keep a wax tablet on a peg by the door, one concession to inkless bookkeeping. You scratch notes with a bone stylus, last sack of apples, frost took 2 carrots, sweet today, vent half. The marks blur when your thumb brushes them, but you rewrite tomorrow. Memory is the real ledger. The tablet is a politeness toward fatigue. Sometimes after a hard day, you sit on the lowest step with the lantern dim and listen. The cellar has sounds if you stop arguing with the world long enough to hear them. A bead of water lets go from a beam and kisses the floorstone. A potato settles its weight against a neighbour, and the straw answers with a whisper. Farther off, a barrel wood creaks the way a ship hull does when the river turns in its sleep. None of it is speech. All of it is reassurance. The earth is holding what you asked it to hold. You rise and pull a basket together, without consulting your hunger. 2 onions, 3 carrots, the cabbage that has decided to be brave. 1 more night, a wedge of beet as red as a stubborn sunset. You touch each bin in thanks, a habit you picked up as a child, when gratitude needed something to do with its hands. At the steps, you pause, turn, and take the air into your chest, the way one might take the hand of a calm friend. Up in the kitchen, the fire will make a different sort of weather. Pots will say their quiet music. Knives will remember your grip. But here, in the earth's belly, the future keeps breathing slow, untroubled breaths. You close the door carefully. The outside air rushes in, and then stops as if embarrassed by its own eagerness. The leather loop falls against the wood with its usual soft tap. You mark the hinge with a smudge of soot, your private sign that the door is shut true, and you go inside heavier with food and lighter with worry. Later, when the night leans its weight against the walls, and the wind prowls for gaps, you will sleep, knowing a piece of the world is working while you are not. Salt holds, smoke persuades, vinegar argues, but the cellar simply stays. It is the one ally that wins by standing still. Honey and herb sweetness and healing. You hear the bees before you see them. A low thread of sound, braided through the afternoon, steady as a spinner's wheel. The hives stand where the hedge breaks for the orchard, pale straw skeps lifted on wooden stools to keep damp and mice at a respectful distance. Sun warms the woven spirals. Bees come and go with the composure of practiced workers. Each returns dusted in yellow or green, a travelling fleck of summer. You stand still, and the air writes circles around you. This is the most polite industry you know. Honey begins as a rumour of flowers and ends as a promise in a jar. When the clover flares white and the linden trees tremble with perfume, the skeps thrum as if they have swallowed a bell. You touch the straw and feel the life inside heat built from thousands of small decisions. Harvest is not greed, it is negotiation. Smoke curls from a twist of dried thyme in your hand, softening tempers. You lift the skep slide out a comb, and its hexagons hold sunlight made obedient. The weight surprises you each year, how the sweet can feel so serious. Back in the cottage, you set the comb over a clay bowl and watch patience turn solid into liquid. It falls in slow amber sheets, trapping the room in the scent of meadow and wood. No flame is needed, no spell beyond gravity. You warm what clings with the breath of the hearth, and then pour careful as a scribe. A jar fills, and the surface gathers a lens, where the window repeats itself upside down. You seal with beeswax the colour of old hay. Wax frets the fingers for a moment, and then yields a soft arithmetic of heat and pressure. Later, You will use that same wax to cap jars of medicine and to mend a crack in the lid of the salt tub. Bees teach thrift with every gift. Honey keeps what you ask it to keep. It holds pears that would bruise if you scolded them with a glance. It holds walnuts that prefer company in winter. You submerge slices of quince firm and perfumed, and months later lift them like a memory that stayed sweet on purpose. You cut strips of ginger deer spice, bought with eggs and favours, and let honey tame their fire without scolding it into boredom. You brush honey over cheese, and the rind learns to glisten. You tuck a wedge away in a cool corner, a feast decreased to a patient promise. The bee's gold works in the other direction too. It draws hurt into quiet. A scrape along your knuckle from a careless moment at the woodpile. A blister raised by the earnest grip of a new shoe honey laid thick under a linen strip hushes the skin. You do not speak of antimicrobial or osmotic pull. You say it tastes of summer and argues with rot until rot leaves the room. Propolis dark, bitter, resinous arrives with the combs like a stubborn cousin. The monks would call it balm. You call it glue and remedy, both packing a crack, painting a scratch, letting its sharp scent write a warning to what you cannot see. You keep a jar of oxymel on the shelf, a marriage of vinegar and honey laced with thyme and hyssop, because throats forget their manners in damp weather. A spoonful slides like a warm ribbon, and the cough remembers to be polite. There are electuaries too, the sweet pastes you fold around bitterness, until bitterness learns to behave ground fennel for wind, a mutter of ginger for cold bellies, a pinch of ground rue when you need stern company. You do not promise cures, you promise ease. Ease is a good promise. Above the beam, where the smoked meats keep their vigil herbs hang in tidy confusion. Bundles of sage, rosemary, yarrow mint, braids of garlic that look like pale ropes laid up for a tiny voyage. You cut them at the honest hour after dew, before the sun climbs into bossiness, and bind with a twist of flax. They gather themselves as they dry, turning from field shapes to kitchen shapes, from wild to willing. When your fingers crush a leaf in the cold of February, and the room blooms green, you understand why monks write books about plants. You do not need the book, you have the leaf. Herbs are more than flavour, they are floor and breath and border. You strewn rushes with handfuls of sweet flag and cosmary, so the house walks on green and not on dust. You tuck lavender into linen, because sleep listens to scent as much as to silence. You simmer rosemary in a pot near the doorway when sickness walks the lanes, not because you believe in miracles, but because strength sometimes arrives on a smell. Pennyroyal keeps fleas thoughtful, wormwood persuades flies to reconsider their plans, mint rinses a cup until yesterday's onion forgets itself. In a shallow dish, you keep salt herbed with crushed bay sage, and the zest of whatever citrus found its way to market before frost sent the traders sulking south. That salt isn't just seasoning, it is a small vault. Wrapped in paste and set by the coals, a joint of mutton learns patience and gives it back. Butchers will tell you where the muscle runs. Herbs will tell you how to forgive it. When beans threaten dullness, a sage leaf, fried in a spoon of fat, shakes them awake with a clean hand. You keep oils the way you keep stories, some clear, some cloudy, all named. An earthen bottle hides a sprig of rosemary steeped in last year's press. It pours wintergreen onto a crust when the day needs cheering. Another jar traps garlic under oil so it cannot escape. A thumbprint of that, on the pan, persuades onions to turn honest. A darker jar, tied with string and warning, holds rue in vinegar for days when appetite will not answer its name. You label with twine and habit, knowing each by the colour that catches light, when you lift the shelf cloth. The garden that feeds your hanging harvest is not grand 4 beds and a border, but it remembers more than you planted. Calendula crowds the path with cheerful coins. Marigold petals dry to saffron shadows that tint broth when true saffron costs too many favours. Plantain crouches where boots have been unkind. A crushed leaf is the peasant's salve for small stings and nettles' jokes. Chamomile turns the end of bad days towards sleep. Comfrey is here 2 big leaves like rough tongues, but you keep it for poultice, not for stew. Some plants prefer to talk to skin rather than stomachs. Knowing which is kitchen and which is cupboard is part of the apprenticeship. At times, the churchyard instructs you as much as the garden. The herb wives show you tansy at Easter, a bitter lesson baked into cake to remind the body what season it is. In Lentfish, learns to share a pan with parsley and a squeeze of lemon if a traveller has a gift. Without lemon, a splash of your oxymel stands in. Feast days get rosemary tucked under fowl-skin sage, whispered across the platter. Time invited to sit on the edge of everything. Abstinence becomes art when herbs take up the music. There are days when sweetness is medicine of the soul rather than the body. You boil honey with water and set it by the hearth with a handful of herbs, mead by intention or accident, depending on what the air decides. When winter sulks, a cup steadies more than hands. You do not drink to forget. You drink to remember that flowers are real, even when the world is grey. A small honey cake carried to a neighbour who has lost someone will not fix grief. It will teach grief a gentler chair. You make mistakes. A damp bundle mildews because you grew proud and hung it too thick. A jar of honey thins when the weather sulks and you forgot its cloth. You warm it and promise to mind the day better. A child picks foxglove because its purple trumpets have good manners, and you teach names quickly and sternly. Herbs are conversation partners, not servants. They require attention and repay it by refusing to be boring. Night moves in on cat feet, and the cottage smells like an apothecary who has learned to laugh. You strip thyme leaves into a pot stir, in a spoon of honey, and the steam makes the room feel kinder than the world beyond the door. On the table, a comb of beeswax waits for tomorrow's mending. Beside it, a little cone of incense you made from crumbs of resin and last year's lavender stems to sweeten sick rooms where windows don't oblige. You set a sprig of rosemary by the beam for memory and tuck a sprig of rue above the lintel for courage. None of this is magic, and all of it is. When you finally lie down, your hands smell of summer's shorthand resin leaf sweet. The bees will sleep in a humming stillness, their queen warm, under a quilt of living bodies. The herbs will go dark and give back what they know to the night. In jars, fruit will rest under gold. On rafters, bundles will finish their patient contraction from field to flavour. You close your eyes and keep the taste of a teaspoon of honey on your tongue, because the day asked for one last kindness, and you had it to give. Sweetness is not a luxury here. It is a technique, a preservative, a treaty between perishability and care. So are herbs. So is every small act that teaches time to behave. In a world that forgets quickly, you gather what remembers nectar made into amber, leaves made into language, work made into ease. And the winter that is coming, as winters do, will meet a shelf where the sun is shelved and it will have to sit down and share. Winter faith. When preservation meets religion. Snow arrives with quiet authority, rewriting edges, softening fences, making the lane into a pale idea. Church bells carry farther in this weather, the iron sound laid gently across fields, where nothing moves except smoke and the occasional crow who doesn't care for doctrine. You wrap your cloak tighter and step into a world that has agreed for now to be simple, white above hard, below breath like steam. The bell calls and winter answers with footsteps. Inside the nave, the air is colder than outside the stone, having kept a memory of autumn's shade. Candles lean their small gold into the grey. The priest's voice is careful as bread sliced thin. He speaks of a calendar you can taste, fast days and feast days, ember tides and vigils, Advent's clean hunger and Lent's long schooling. The church keeps time the way a cellar keeps turnips, not to hoard, but to survive. You bow your head, and the weeks arrange themselves like jars on a shelf, each with its label and use. Fasting here is not starvation dressed up in Latin. It is appetite taught to walk on a narrow path, less meat, no meat fish, instead of flesh oil, instead of dripping almond milk where cow's milk would have been. It sounds austere when you say it like a rule, but in a cold season, rules are sometimes just ladders laid over a ditch. The day's pottage thickens with barley and cabbage. A taste of brined eel encourages it to believe in itself. Bread is cut smaller, but not meanly. Honey appears on Sundays as a psalm you can swallow. Vinegar sharpens dull hours. You do not go hungry, you go attentive. The trade winds of faith move through your kitchen. Stockfish cod dried hard, as a saint's resolve comes south in bundles that clack like bones. You soak it in water, changed and changed again, until it yields, then simmer with onions and parsley, as if telling it a kind story. Herring arrives salted shiny, as a sermon well delivered. You desalinate with patience, and poach it just to the point where it forgets the sea's temper. The river, less dramatic than the ocean, but closer to your shovel, gives what it can pike if you are lucky tench. If you are honest eels that accept both brine and smoke, and therefore sit comfortably in the Lenten mind. There are workarounds everyone knows, and no one confesses too loudly. Goose is a bird, yes, but dripping is still dripping. You save the fat for feast days, even if the linen, wrapped jar calls to you from the back of a shelf. Cheese lives in a grey area, and abbey kitchens have their own theories that arrive at your table as customs with the serial numbers filed off. Almonds are dear, but a handful pounded and boiled makes a milk that passes scrutiny and soothes soup into silk. You do not cheat, you interpret. Interpretation is how the poor remain both obedient and fed. The calendar's genius is that it matches what the pantry can stand. Advent arrives just when the charm of autumn's plenty has worn thin, and you are ready, if not eager, to make a virtue of restraint. Lent takes place when Cellars have learned the habit of absence. The church names that absence and asks you to walk through it with a straight back. Between there are saints' days that lift lids and make room for meat or butter or the kind of pastry that remembers summer by whisper rather than shout. The pattern is old enough to feel like weather. At table, prayer shifts flavour with the fare. On feast days, it's gratitude that has trouble staying in its chair. During fasts, it's gratitude that has learned to sit up straight. Either way, you eat together longer because chewing slower is another word for conversation. Children learn that a bowl of cabbage can taste like generosity if shared properly. Neighbours learn that a loaf cut small tastes bigger when the cutting hand is cheerful. The poor box near the chancel keeps its mouth open, and you tuck a crust there, sometimes not because you can spare it, but because you need to believe that someday a crust will be waiting when your own shelf goes shy. Monks have the cleanest version of this choreography. You have seen their refectory long tables, bowls like brothers, silence that hums with spoon and breath. Their fasts are sterner than yours, their feasts more orderly. Yet the herbs that climb their walls are the same. and the smoke that writes on their beams is the twin of yours. In spring, when the river softens their pond, offers carp trained by centuries to keep holy company, you trade onions for a lesson in pond-keeping shady corners, a sluice that breathes winter feed, that is more intention than abundance. They call it stewardship. You call it sense with a halo. Not all piety is edible. You sweep rushes more often in Lent because clean floors make thin meals feel like choices. You burn rosemary at the threshold when sickness prowls and you cannot afford incense. You hang a small cross of last year's palm by the larder door and pretend it disciplines mice, though you know the cat does that better. Ritual dresses practicality in hope, and hope eats well when there is something to do with the hands. Inequality has a season too. The Manners fasts are fat with fish and almond milk. Their Fridays taste like your Sundays. They own ice houses where blocks sleep under straw until midsummer. They can serve chilled wine while you are still arguing with the well. You ignore the sting by working. The stew pot does not answer envy. It answers fire. When the steward measures alms in thin coins, you share nettles and the recipe for making them less than a joke. Outlasting is its own theology. There are days when the snow turns to glass rain and the lane speaks in a brittle tongue. On such days the bell calls for rogation prayers that walk the fields in boots, circling boundaries with hymns, in case heaven needs reminding where hunger lives. You go because walking warms what pottage cannot reach, and song stretches the lungs. The priest sprinkles holy water on the hedges. Children find this wildly persuasive. You find it moderately helpful. The field finds it indifferent, and then in April finds it persuasive after all. Faith is often a lagging indicator. Your kitchen in winter has the scent of rules kept kindly. Oil not lard glistens in the pan. Onions soften into sweetness you don't have to apologize for. A heel of smoked eel leans its shadow into a cabbage soup. Bread comes from the oven in smaller loaves, blessed not by size but by the story. It approves that enough is not a cousin of scarcity, but of precision. You do not become holier by being hungry. You become steadier by noticing what feeds you and how. When Easter finally stands up like a man from a bed, the bells are scandalously loud. Butter returns like a forgiven cousin. Meat looks startled to find itself welcome. Honey remembers how to be reckless. You feast without shame because the feasts meant something. You kept a promise to a calendar that kept a promise to your pantry. The jars on the back shelf look surprised to be still standing. You thank them with the best gratitude you own a day off. Night comes later now, but winter has one more thing to say before it leaves. You open a jar of pickled apples that have been practicing brightness in the dark. The room fills with a memory of leaves. You eat, you breathe. You cross yourself because habit is faster than thought, and you understand again what the season taught. Preservation is a liturgy, fasting, a metronome, and hunger. When invited, not imposed a tutor who prefers whisper to rod. You bank the fire with a gentle hand and let the room become a chapel of sleep. Outside the snow thinks about being rain. Inside faith and food have agreed to walk in step until morning. The hands that keep time. Morning begins with inventory, not of numbers, but of promises. You stand before the shelf and read without letters a rind dark as bark. That means cheese has learned patience. A row of jars, each holding a small imprisoned summer. A curl of smoke-tinted bacon that looks like a sentence with a long, calm clause. You have no ledger open on the table, yet the room tallies for you. Your hands scuffed and salted and nicked are the accountants. They are also the choir, the carpenters, the physicists who never use the word. You start where the day always starts, with touch. A thumb to test a rind, a fingertip to press a pellicle, a palm to weigh a cabbage's mood. Freshness announces itself with bounce. Readiness with a certain seriousness that does not yield. Your hands learned these dialects long before your tongue did. They hold time the way clay holds water, not forever, never perfectly, but enough to grow something. On the table, the knife is honest. Its edge is not a threat, but a promise that food will do as it's told and turn into pieces that behave. You slice fat, thin enough to be generous without being foolish. You cube bread for soup so the broth can find it in every spoon. You shave a little smoked fish to teach the pot humility. The knife is a metronome, each cut a beat. You do not rush. Speed is for panicked hearts and runaway horses. In a kitchen, speed bruises. Rhythm feeds. This house remembers other hands, some broad, some fine, some with the delicate tremor of old age, some with the purposeful mischief of youth. Your grandmother slapped dough, as if waking it from a sulk. Your father salted like a mason setting stones. Your child pulls herbs with 2 fingers, because your voice said gently, and the plant believed it. Hands inherit without ceremony. A scar across the knuckle is a genealogical record. The winter of the blunt hatchet, the spring of the proud rooster, the summer of the cracked jar you tried to save, and nearly did. Preservation, for all its jars and tubs and clandestine corners, is less about equipment than choreography. Salt hands to smoke hands, to cellar hands, to gentle, clean hands that plate and pour. Each pair learns where to step and where to stand still. A cure that began under crystals moves to rafters for a day's incense, then down to a cool dark where it will listen to stones think. Your hands learn to pass it along without interruption, the way a good storyteller pauses only where the breath demands. You lift the trapdoor and descend into the cellar to fetch what the noon will need. Your lantern writes circles on stone. Onions blink sleepily. Apples consider your tread and decide not to bruise. You select by temperament, not just by condition. These carrots add sweetness to a stern cabbage. That turnip will tolerate a long simmer without sulking. Up top again, your hands turn cold into warm. You rub life back into a loaf by the fire. You rinse the grit from leaks and feel them slip to cleanliness. You lay a palm on the pot's shoulder, as if greeting a friend who arrives early and leaves late. At midday, the village moves by reputation. People know which door yields a sour that lifts a dough without complaint, whose fish smokes without bitterness, where a spoon of last year's honey sits waiting for a cough. Hands travel as rumours. The widower down the lane lost a crock to mould. You send a ladle of brine and the trick of laying a cabbage leaf under the weight. The woman who keeps geese too proudly trades a jar of rich fat for lessons in storing onions with patience and pageantry. The school of endurance is mostly correspondence. The curriculum is mostly kindness. Your hands also protect. A cat's ear twitches at a mouse's ambition, and your hand becomes grateful before your mouth can frame the thanks. A child reaches for a knife's bright logic, and your hand arranges the world so curiosity meets a carrot instead of the edge. You learn to tie the knot that does not slip, to set the lid that does not warp, to feel in a rope the difference between holding and choking. This is not sentiment, it's engineering remembered by skin. When the afternoon leans towards settling, you make rounds like a quiet steward. A jar's lid has puckered a hair. You warm wax and smooth it flat. A sausage's cord sighs under weight. You retie it with a loop that will not complain tomorrow. A barrel's hoop has lost its swagger. You persuade it with wedge and mallet not to bully, but to resume its vows. Your hands don't argue, they consult. The world prefers compliance when asked instead of ordered. Failure visits. You pour it a small chair and learn. The batch that soured beyond saving becomes pig feed, or a sour scrub that cleans boards to honesty. The rind that cracked teaches you about drafts. The apples that softened teach the calmness of stewing with a squeeze of something bright. Your hands, not your pride, take notes. They remember the roughness of a mistake and avoid it next season as naturally as you avoid a low beam after the first unwelcome conversation with your forehead. Toward evening, the kitchen composes itself. The pot murmurs in a grammar you could translate if pressed onions first, so sweetness has time, roots next for ballast, greens last, so hope remains green. A coin of fat from the smoked belly dissolves and turns the air persuasive. You know the heat is right by the way steam curls rather than charges. You know the salt is right by how water decides to be water and not a scold. A pinch of herb between finger and thumb, rubbed until the room remembers summer, that is not technique, that is courtesy. You break bread, the loaf sounds correct in your hands. You could count time by that sound, the crusts crack, the sigh of crumb, the soft thump when the heel meets the board. You spread a dab of fresh cheese that never claimed to be more than it is. A spoon of pickle lifts the evening into attention. Honey waits for later, a punctuation mark you award if the day warrants sweetness. Conversation is another preservation, and hands serve it too. You pass bowls, you lean elbows without greed. You pour with the small flourish that says here, be anchored. Stories follow food, the way steam follows soup. The youngest tell tall tales about mice big as badgers. The oldest correct them without cruelty and add a truth about a winter that tried to stay forever and failed. Laughter is brine. It keeps sorrow edible. Night asks the questions. Day cannot phrase. Before you sleep, you go once more around the room with your hands open. They test, they bless, they put things to bed. The fire is banked to an ember grammar that will still be legible at dawn. The door gets its bar, the window its cloth. You run a palm under the beam and brush a fragment of soot into the air. An old habit that feels like erasing yesterday's signature, so today can sign its name. The cat patrols once more and chooses the woven mat. You tuck the rushlight's snuff in its dish, a little cone that learned to die tidily. The room agrees. In the half-light between wake and sleep, you think about what your hands know, that your mouth forgets that time is not just a river hurrying past, but a substance you can knead, evaporate, dissolve, condense, coax, and cellar. You salted time until it changed its mind. You smoked time until it grew a memory worth keeping. You pickled time in a safe sour and taught it manners. You fermented time until it lifted itself, and you with it. You buried time in the earth's cool and asked it to rest. You sweetened time so it would come gently when called. You fasted through time so desire would learn to walk, not gallop. None of this broke time. All of it braided it into ropes you can climb. What becomes of such ropes? They tie seasons to sanity. They tether hunger to hope. They bind a village into a vessel that crosses harsh months without capsizing. A lord may keep an ice house and speak of mastery. You keep a shelf and speak of stewardship. Mastery loves applause. Stewardship loves continuity. You have seen a great many kinds of wealth, a manners buttery secure as a small church, a market day where spices swagger, a monk's library where pages remember hands older than anyone living. But the wealth that keeps you honest is softer the feel of a jar cooling after the seal, the weight of a ham ready to hang, the small triumph when a bubble breaks under brine exactly when it ought. There is nobility in that, though no herald will paint it on a shield. Your coat of arms is palm lines, and burns that healed true. If the world should change, and it is fond of changing, you would still know how to be here. Take away a tool, and your hands would astonish you with how they improvise. Take away a habit, and they would invent a cousin to bring it back in another shape. They remember what the mind discards when the mind is tired, the angle at which sunlight makes a jar dangerous, the tone a barrel takes when its stave wants attention, the exact veck not toward tug that ties a knot both firm and willing. They are better scholars than you are, and less vain. You blow out the light. In darkness, the house glows inwardly, each object emitting its small remembered task. The ham, a pendulum, the jars, constellations, the beam, a staff with notes written in soot. Your hands rest at last. They have done the day's arithmetic. They have kept the agreements with salt and smoke and vinegar and patience and earth and sweetness and restraint. They have argued with entropy and lost politely in little ways so they could win politely in larger ones. When sleep finally persuades you, it is with the knowledge that morning will ask for the same music and your hands will play it, not for applause, for supper, for neighbours, for children who will inherit the key signatures, for the long, ordinary miracle of enough. You have not conquered time. You have collaborated with it until it learned your name. And so ends another quiet chapter from the world of those who had little, yet found ways to endure everything. In the cracks of their walls and the calluses of their hands lived the wisdom that kept whole villages alive, not through glory, but through patience. If you found peace in this story, or learned something from the stillness of medieval life, stay with us. Like the video, subscribe to Poor Historian, and ring the bell so the next time history whispers about hunger, hope, or the stubborn grace of survival, you'll be here to listen.